All right. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen? We're all good?
Yes, we're all good.
Fantastic. All right. Super excited to be here. I want to thank Sherry and Zoe for giving me this opportunity to collect some thoughts about what I call writing toward reconciliation, metamodernism, and English language haiku. Um, just a couple things before we start. I'm going to use the term haiku to mean the diversity of English language short forms with a Japanese origin. So even though I'm saying haiku, please read into that all the other diversity of forms that are being written now in the 21st century that come from this tradition. I also want to say that some of the concepts that I will be talking about are notoriously fuzzy in terms of definition, in terms of the time periods of these particular literary movements. So this presentation isn't intended to be totalizing or comprehensive or definitive, but just to give us some ideas, stimulate some questions, give us some things to think about in regards to our own practice. As a roadmap, just to kind of guide us through the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to give us some guiding questions to think about as we're going through the presentation. I want to do a brief refresher on what I call the isms. I'll give you a very short, very incomplete history of 20th and 21st century literature. And then we'll look at some examples of some vital dynamic poems written in the 21st century that embody some of these meta-modernist techniques and concepts. And then we will wrap up. So for guiding questions, first of all, I've said it about 15 times so far. I promise you we will define what is meta-modernism. We'll figure out where it came from, how it developed, and how metamodernism as a framework might be useful to us as readers and writers of haiku. And finally, sort of hearkening back to the title of my talk, how is metamodernism writing toward reconciliation? John McGowan, who is a critic, once said, artistic autonomy is neither possible or desirable. The hope and belief that intellectuals can occupy a space outside of society is not only illusionary, but artistically and politically sterile. The purity of the alienated artist forecloses his access to the energies and disputes that are lived within the culture. Now, I know that there are some practitioners of haiku that wish to uphold all of the traditional elements of the form, and that's wonderful. But as McGowan states, if we deny ourselves the access to the energies and the disputes that are happening within our culture now, I think we deny our poetry something vital, energetic, and something that really allows us to connect with our reader. The isms. So I think this little cartoon really shows kind of in a nutshell the difference between modernism, which reigned in the first part of the 20th century, and postmodernism, which reigned in the second part of the 20th century after World War II. Modernists, coming to grips with increased technology and World War I and the birth of psychology and what Nietzsche calls the death of God. They're really sort of kind of wrestling with what life means and becoming alienated and despondent, whereas the postmodernists, also dealing with half a century worth of horrors, sort of take a different tact and they decide to become a little bit more anarchic, a little more play-based. They decide to sort of celebrate this vacuum instead of bemoaning an absence of something. We're probably all familiar with Ezra Pound's edict to make it new, which is sort of the slogan of modernism. And just to briefly recap, if you haven't thought about modernism in a while, modernism was a desire to get rid of past literary tradition. It came from a place that saw realist writing as not real, as contrived, and it wanted to look for new ways to express what goes on with people psychologically, internally. It evolved as a response to critiques of the Victorian morality, social convention, and advances in science that were getting people to think more about the world around them. Modernist techniques, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, include, but they're not limited to, stream of consciousness, narratives with multiple points of view, like we see in Faulkner sometimes, nonlinear or fragmented narratives, free verse, experimental language, collage and disjunctive juxtaposition, symbol and myth, and often dense allusions, if you think about the poetry of T.S. Eliot, for example. Postmodernism comes about as kind of, the writers got the same feeling about modernism that modernist writers got about realism. They saw it as becoming conventional, as becoming a little bit trite. So in part, evolving from a reaction against the literary tradition of modernism, and partially in response to just the overarching philosophical questions rooted in the genocidal horrors of World War II, and then coming up to Vietnam and all of these, terrible world events. Postmodernists attempted to embody something new because they felt the world was changing and needed some new form of expression. They are deeply skeptical of systems. They're deeply skeptical of any pretense to know something. They're deeply skeptical of the stories that sometimes we tell ourselves about ourselves, stories that we tell about our culture. For example, Manifest Destiny in America. They're skeptical of language and meaning-making systems. And in general, they don't really believe in things having a stable, coherent identity. Everything is always in flux. Everything is always changing. So that plus advances in science, advances in political and literary theory, really made writers start to rethink the how of their craft. So postmodern writers, poets and prose writers alike, started using sampling as a technique, taking parts of other texts and embedding them within their work. They were into blurring the borders of genre. They were deliberately obscure sometimes in order to resist easy interpretation. They were very self-reflexive, oftentimes drawing your attention to the fact that what you are reading is a constructed text made by a person with an agenda and with a bias. They increased the multivocality that modernists introduced, but they also brought in indeterminacy and narrative volatility. They used pastiche. They thought about metafiction or storytelling about storytelling. And they introduced intertextuality and parody as well. Two quotes that sort of embody this postmodern ethos. Jean Baudrillard said that postmodernity is said to be a culture of fragmentary sensations, eclectic nostalgia, disposable simulacra, and promiscuous superficiality, in which the traditionally valued qualities of depth, coherence, meaning, originality, and authenticity are evacuated or dissolved amid the random swirl of empty signals. Larry McCaffrey describes postmodernism as being inhabited by people who are, in effect, consuming themselves in the form of images and abstractions through which their desires, sense of identity, and memories are replicated and then sold back to them as products. And if you've spent any time on social media or TikTok or any of these platforms, I think you can probably see a landscape where these quotes could be considered pretty prescient. What comes next? What's postmodernism? This is something that has been called the new sincerity, which I think is a really interesting way of encapsulating this massive movement. Metamodernism is really an umbrella. It takes the good aspects of modernism and the good aspects of postmodernism and brings them together, while at the same time, it remains skeptical of each as a school or system of thought. And basically, metamodernism is a 21st century idea, a school of thought, a framework of ideas that it evolves because the world that is existing in the 21st century is confronted with climate crisis and financial crisis, terrorism, food insecurity, increasing refugee populations, a lot of very troubling, pressing things. But we are also on the cusp of some amazing technological advances and some amazing artwork that is developing. So there are things to be incredibly hopeful and optimistic about. And what metamodernism does is it sort of takes that sense of optimism, perhaps the enthusiasm from modernism, the hope that collective populations have in the 21st century, that in spite of all these problems that we can solve them, that we can come together, that we are demanding change, we are demanding something else. All of that comes to play with metamodernism. To sort of think about how Vermeulen and van der Acker describe it, metamodernism rejects resignation, it rejects nihilism, and it rejects disenfranchisement, and it asks for engagement with critical social issues. It, and this is a quote, oscillates between a modern enthusiasm and a postmodern irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivete and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. It is a pragmatic idealism, bringing in aspects of a neo-romanticism, a desire for interconnectedness both with nature and with each other. And that is rooted in a sort of a network thinking, an idea of everything being connected to one another. And it's informed with a sense of wonder and delight. When we look at haiku that have been written in the 21st century, we can find several different techniques that are at play. Now, when I say metamodern haiku do these things, no one haiku does all of these things, and you may find a poem that does one, but none of the others. So this is just kind of a list to give us some things to think about and perhaps to use in our own practice. Metamodern haiku often express a sense of informed wonder, not naive or childlike wonder, but a wonder that comes filtered through experience. They often express a heightened sense of engagement. So instead of a haiku being just an observation, it's an observation plus an opinion. You know the stance that a haiku writer has on a particular issue. Meta-modern haiku embrace the contemporary and everything that that means and the contemporary moment. They don't shy away from it in favor of tradition. Although they may use traditional elements, they also open their toolbox and bring in contemporary elements. They see and respond to language as a tool, a system, a series of systems, all of which have agenda, bias that need to be unpacked, that need to be dealt with and thought about. Meta-modern haiku are linguistically inclusive. They incorporate diction borrowed or sampled from different areas. So you might read a haiku and it's got a pop culture reference, or it uses internet language or references genre fiction, commercials, instruction manuals, what have you. It also, brings in different languages. Now we see haiku that are being written that even, switch languages in a monoku in order to create a different effect. They draw from the diction of different disciplines. We see many haiku that borrow from physics or psychology, using terms specific to those disciplines to create a poetic texture or to communicate an idea. And we often see haikus in different registers, colloquial register, formal diction, or a professional register. Meta-modern haiku reappropriate and recontextualize portions of text. Sometimes they're straight up found haiku, which we've seen for several years being written. Haiku that are almost wholesale lifted from another text, recontextualized, maybe re-edited in order to come up with the individual's poetic expression. They use polyvocality and polysemy. For example, you'll see haiku that have multiple voices within one poem, which is really interesting. Or haiku that, hinge upon the different meanings of a particular word. Several haiku will use visual, graphic, or paratextual strategies to communicate an idea. They employ figures of speech, wordplay, puns, neologisms, etc. They use formal innovation. If you look at some of the past award winners of the Trailblazer Award, you'll see many vital, interesting uses of form that haiku have sort of blossomed into over the past few years. They celebrate the reality of imagination or the primacy of dream logic. There are, certain journals, for example, Bones was a journal that really put together a lot of these haiku that maybe some people might critique as desk coup or not about real experience, but they're about imaginative experience, which is a type of reality, or dream logic, which is a type of logic. Meta-modern haiku might be meta haiku, or haiku about language, haiku about the practice of writing haiku. Meta-modern haiku often confront socio-political concerns, issues, or problems, either obliquely or directly. We'll see some examples of that when we get to the example portion. And they do so in order to provoke understanding or engagement or some sort of action on behalf of the reader. They might reject the use of an explicit kigo in order to reflect sort of an aseasonality, or a seasonal shift or degradation, which is a word that Alan Summers has used when he has sort of talked about what's been happening, in relation to climate change and how that affects the seasons and how that then affects kigo. And these haiku may use cuts that are starkly disjunctive, more starkly disjunctive than we've seen in the past, more radical than traditional haiku. Clayton Beach in Modern Haiku 50.2 had a really nice line at the end of his essay where he talks about the history of haiku and why haiku writers should understand the history of haiku. He talks about sort of a new paradigm. And I just want to read the last line of his beautiful conclusion to his essay about a new paradigm for appreciating the haiku genre, in which a plurality of voices can join the conversation of what the word haiku has meant in the past, what it means to living poets today, and what it will come to mean in the future. And I think that's a beautiful thought to lead us into some examples of meta-modern haiku. I've included a few poems of mine, a few poems that I've gathered from research for this presentation to give you a taste of what meta-modern haiku sound like, feel like, and possibly look like. This is a wonderful poem by Michael Nichols Wisdom, which I fell in love with when I saw it originally. China shipping, China shipping, China shipping, Dongfang, China shipping. And the beauty of this poem, when I first saw it, I was absolutely flummoxed as to what was happening. But as I came to think about it and discuss it, I realized that this is an individual sitting at a railroad crossing and the train is going by, and this is what's written on each of the train cars as it passes. And I think it speaks to this notion of 21st century economy, flattening the globe, thinking about, you know, the international trade scene. And here's an individual sitting somewhere in middle America, and they're seeing these Chinese products going by on this train, and just sort of thinking about what that means about the world and about their place in it. Here's another one that thinks about commodification and thinks about commerce, thinks about the marketing of nostalgia. This is a poem of mine that was in Dada Cuckoo earlier this year. For a limited time only, teenage moonlight. And that for a limited time only phrase is certainly borrowed from commercial language. Julie Schwerin had an amazing poem in Password last May, which is a beautiful new journal. Only on days ending in Y, another mass shooting. And I think this does something incredibly remarkable with language, focusing on the multiple meanings of that Y sound in the middle, and deftly expressing the frustration that many of us feel about contemporary culture in America. A poem of mine from Five Fleas deals with a similar subject. Another school shooting, a movie in his mind. And to me, this sort of brings in this language that we read about when we look at the psychology of school shooters, how they view themselves as sort of immersing themselves in the media that they might be fans of, and becoming that star with the respect that that entails, that they feel maybe they do not have in their present life. Again, you see in these are not traditional subject matters for traditional haiku, but it's something new. This is Joseph Weschelberger's amazing poem, Hummingbird. And it is vital and dynamic and delightful on the page. I don't think I've seen a poem that captures sort of the flitting, surprising nature of a hummingbird as much as this one does. It's a joy to read. It's a delight to read. This poem is by Petro CK. It recently took first place in this year's Mirtha Senryu contest, which I had the pleasure of judging. All of Us, Icarus Falling, Howler Monkeys. And this addresses climate crisis. It's rooted in stories that came out of Mexico about the heat rising so much that howler monkeys in the trees were passing out and dying and falling to the ground. And Petro CK really, he brings in myth to create such an urgent message, such a desperate message for us to take away from this beautifully rendered poem. Kurt Linderman, in Trash Panda, which is a journal that deals with poetry of the Anthropocene. Again, he has a delightful poem. I laughed when I read it, and then I thought immediately after about the implications of this, which hopefully was Kurt's intention. Ospreys upgrading their perches to 5G. Ospreys upgrading their perches to 5G. It's tongue-in-cheek, but it also, makes you wonder and worry about the implications of our technology and human expansion on the natural world. This is a poem by Brian Rickert that I read several months ago, and he generously gave me permission to include it in this presentation. It will be published in the next Failed Haiku. It's been accepted, Brian told me, but you're going to get a little preview here of this amazing poem, which directly confronts race and the cultural environment in America. America, the beautiful thing slave labor builds. America, the beautiful thing slave labor builds. It takes the title of that song that many Americans know and turns it into something revealing. I think this poem by Robert Moyer also does something similar, drawing attention to the history that so many people do not want to hear regarding the American past. Plantation tour, slave quarter walls whitewashed. Plantation tour, slave quarter walls whitewashed. This is a poem by Kala Ramesh. It was published in Haiku 21, which came out in 2011. Heaven's river from where to where? Heaven's river from where to where? And in this delightfully ambiguous poem, it really makes me wonder who has waterfront property on the shore of Heaven's River, and how debatable that is in human political scenes. How, if you think about religious conflict, and the tying of land to religion and to a sense of place and identity. I think this poem may not be about all these subjects, but it certainly made me think about all of these subjects that we're currently seeing in the world today. Here's another one. This is from Five Fleas that I wrote, that takes title of A Christmas Carol that many Americans may know, and casts it in a way, hopefully, to get us to think about the juxtaposition of war and peace. Bombs away in a manger. Bombs away in a manger. This came out in Under the Basho last year, and maybe this needs a little bit of unpacking, but this uses a little bit of that multivocality that I talked about as a technique. Bitter flint, and the name of the star is Wormwood. Bitter flint, and the name of the star is Wormwood. This references a biblical passage from Revelation about a star that descends to earth that's really an angel, and it lands in the water and turns it bitter, and people drink the water and die. Flint is Flint, Michigan. If anyone is familiar with the news stories from a few years back about their water system, which was poisoning the mostly poor, mostly Black residents, and nobody wanted to fix it. So those people did not have access to clean water, and had to suffer through the maldevelopment of their children and all kinds of other issues because of that. And I'm going to end with this poem from Scott Metz from his incredible collection, Lakes and Now Wolves, which I think is one of the best haiku books to come out in the 21st century. The frog again becomes echo, again becomes road. The frog again becomes echo, again becomes road. And I picked this to end on because I think it harkens back to Bashot's frog and its famous jump, a splash that resonates throughout the centuries, but it also contextualizes that frog splash as an echo, something that is that happened in the past, that we feel something of it now, but then it gets transformed into a road into the future, which is what I think metamodernism is doing for haiku writers of this time period. I would love to carry on the conversation. We could probably talk for weeks about what I just gave a brief sketch of. We could probably talk for weeks about any single one of the poems that I highlighted. But if you would like to further the conversation, or if you have questions or comments, you can please email me. My email address is there. You can contact me on Facebook. That's the social media platform that I am most on. And if you'd like to read some more of my poetry, I was lucky enough to release Dimes of Light, which is a short chapbook from Yavanika Press about a month ago. And earlier this year, I was selected to be in Off the Main Road, 6 Contemporary Haiku Writers from Alba Publishing, which is a dynamite collection with 5 really, really talented haiku writers and also me. So if you're interested in grabbing those, I can put the links in the chat, or I can email you the links if you're interested. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry, and I really hope my mic didn't give out and I got disconnected and I just gave that presentation to myself in the bedroom. So if somebody could let me know.